Our 44th class in our APUSH journey together is entitled New Strength for American Women, and it coincides with chapter 12.2 of your book. And if you're watching this video because you were absent, please go to Google Classroom and answer the questions associated with this. But if you use your book or this video, it is in order. It should be pretty doable if you were absent. And I started off class with a brainstorm. And I asked, what reasons would you attribute to why, historically, women have been subjugated by men? And some people answer, testosterone over estrogen or physical strength, that sort of thing. Probably the best answer is the fact that women have children and they have to breastfeed the children. Having those children keep them put compared to men who could venture off and do their own thing because they didn't have to breastfeed the children. And then I went even deeper into the brainstorm and I posed these questions. Throughout history, when and where would it be the worst to be born female? And then throughout history, when and where would it be best to be born female? And the general consensus is now is probably the best time to be female, and America is not a bad place to be female, especially when you compare it to the rest of history. Not everybody agrees with that, but that's a general consensus, okay? And then we got into the historical portion of it, the word feminism. When did feminism begin? And in the 1850s, the dictionary definition of feminism said it qualifies as females. And then over time, feminism was an advocacy for equality of the sexes, connected with the women's movements for voting rights and legal reform in France, Germany, England, and U.S. So although this is a U.S. history class, this movement was going on in other nations, okay? But the roots of feminism are much earlier, best defined as identifications of common problems experienced by women within society. You may remember Wollstonecraft in her book, that sort of thing, okay? Now, this word patriarchy in yellow, a word you may not know, but a word that I need you to know. Patriarchy, it's a society in which authority, value, or social order are consolidated in male lineage. Fathers pass authority and property to sons. Now, it's not universal, but it is widely prevalent in the world's cultures, these social hierarchies. Now, in modern times, these patriarchal tendencies have replaced ancient egalitarian tendencies, okay? Now, feminists experience varying degrees of tension with patriarchal tendencies or expectations. So what this means is, as a woman, what are the expectations to be a woman in society? And do you have full access to rights and privileges and power and that sort of thing, okay? And you see, situations with patriarchy having to do with inheritance and marriage and names. And women in the past who chose not to play the game, they had these words for them, spinsters, old maids. Okay, they chose not to do it, and they were kind of cast away as weirdos in the past, okay? Now, patriarchy has been codified law in recent history, okay? I mean recent history. I'm looking at the big span of 5,000 years of history. But if you look at English U.S. common law in the 1600s to the 1800s, they treated husband as the heads of the family and the wives were the hearts. And there were laws of coverture, where the wife is covered by her husband who speaks for her, provides for her, takes care of the entire household. I've been in cemeteries where you don't know which woman was buried. For example, my wife would be Mrs. Anthony Salsiccioli, but it didn't say who she was, and that was part of it. Also, there was no voting for women because their views were supposed to be covered by the male relatives or husband. The men would speak on behalf or vote on behalf of their wives. And married women and widows didn't have rights to own property or to their own money. They might be represented by their husbands or male children if they were called into court as witnesses. So it wasn't a good situation, I should say, to be a woman. It was a bad situation to be a woman. Now, the roots of 19th century Western feminism, we did have subcultures where women had a more prominent role. If you look at convents, if you looked at Protestant Quakers. And in the age of reason and revolution, the Enlightenment, rights of man and rights of women, okay? And for the first time, people were questioning and fighting against these patriarchal laws and customs. Now, the Revolution era and the rights of women had international things that preceded the American movement, and it was around the world. This movement was not just American but America was a huge influence on it. So, for example, an American woman, Abigail Adams, to her husband, remember the ladies as you are planning a new U.S. Constitution. And Judith Sargent Murray's book on the equality of sexes, and Olympe de Gouges, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen in the French Revolution, and the Wollstonecraft book, Vindication of the Rights of Women. These were the preceding items to today's class, which was the first wave of American feminism. We're not going to cover the second and third today. America has had 3 waves. This is the first one. And in yellow might be the most important thing I'm saying in this video. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This was the beginning of a national scale organizing for women's rights in the U.S. The Declaration of Sentiments, styled in the way of the Declaration of Independence. Frederick Douglass signed it. The allegiance of abolitionists with the early women's rights movement. Remove all forms of bondage for society. So, in short, it's the first formal gathering where they said, we want equal rights. We want to vote. We want to say. And it's no surprise that the abolitionist movement was connected with this, because they had a similar goal. As people are saying, we need to get rid of slavery and letting all people, okay, white people, black people, women people, men people, have the same rights as men. Okay, so let's go into a little more detail of the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. Now, these resolutions were passed, and it called for full equality, including the right to vote for women. They called it out. They fired that shot. It made the newspapers. People knew about it. And women could hear about this, and if they were able to, they could get on board. Easier said than done. And some key people, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an American leader in the movement in 1848. She was there at Seneca Falls, and she drafted the first organized demand for women's suffrage in the United States. She lived a long life and was a crusader her entire life for the rights of women. Lucretia Mott. She was an early feminist activist and a strong advocate for ending slavery. Powerful speaker, and she dedicated her life speaking out against racial and gender injustice. Now, this was a less progressive time than we're living in now, so it was a lot of boldness for her to do that. And you can see this connection between the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement being women's fighting to vote. Susan B. Anthony. They made $1 with her likeness on it. I remember that as a little kid. From 1979 to 1981. Unfortunately, they were about the same size as a quarter, and people didn't like that very much because they got confused. But Susan B. Anthony was a champion of temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, equal pay for equal work, and she was one of the most visible leaders of the movement. Along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she traveled around the country delivering speeches in favor of women's suffrage, and she took a lot of grief for that. There were some men who treated her very, very poorly throughout her travels, but like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she fought her entire life. Now, the bloomers was a style of dress popularized by Amelia Bloomer, and you can see here that when women started wearing these pants, it liberated them from the long hoop skirts that were virtually required for middle-class women, made any activity from walking upstairs to physical activity very difficult. So the clothing that women were supposed to wear just increased the patriarchy. When I teach world history, there's a parallel in Chinese history where they bound women's feet, where they physically could not get around very well. It kept women in place. So if a woman were to wear bloomers, that's a statement to say, hey, I'm trying to liberate myself here. And it was a big process. Bear in mind, Seneca Falls was 1848, and women couldn't vote till 1920. In those years, 72 years, there was a lot of difficulties, a lot of fighting. Here's one example. Here's Alice Paul, who went on a hunger strike to get women to vote, and there's people who are force-feeding her so she's not a martyr. That's how dedicated they were. These are women who were willing to die for the cause. They were very, very committed to the cause. And here's a primary source, a little, propaganda by the other side about no to women's suffrage, okay, and the association opposed. 90% of women either don't want it or don't care. That's a lie. Because it means, anyway, you can look at all this nonsense. And there was a big movement to keep people in check. Okay. Now, in the end, bear in mind the Seneca Falls movement and the abolitionist movement were tied together. Progress was made. In 1870, the 15th Amendment The third of the Civil War amendments was passed that all men, regardless of race, could vote. And then there were some challenges that states put on to make it difficult for them to vote, but that is progress. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment passes, giving women the right to vote. In dollars to donuts, you can see here in America, women could vote in 1920, and this is a global scale. And you can see the majority of nations in the world in the 20th century, end of the 19th century, well, here's New Zealand, the end of the 19th century, allowing women to vote. But it was a slow go. It was a long process. And I want to end on a personal note, okay? My beloved grandmother, who I adored, she was born in 1916. Here's a picture of us from 30-something years ago. And I think about my own grandmother was born into a world where she could not vote. And I have 2 daughters, and I feel fortunate that they have access to jobs, sports, and life choices that could not have been made throughout most of history. And the reason they do have these rights and these choices is the work of these people long before us who put themselves out there and fought very hard to progress us into a more equal direction. So I commend those people, and I'm thankful for those people on a personal note. So anyway, again, if you were absent, either use the book or use this video or a conjunction of the two. Answer those questions, turn them into me, and we'll be all well and good. So thank you for watching.